Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, as-salatu was-salamu Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah ta'ala, today we're taking a pause from our weekly series on Ad-Da'u wa-Dawa, Illness and the Cure by Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah. And we're talking about something that has occurred in the United States internationally, about a case that is really making everyone a loss for words, angry, upset, sad, depressed, frustrated, and a whole lot of different emotions that people are feeling. What I intend to do, inshallah ta'ala, in this class is to address an issue that is technically not actually related to the case itself per se, but it's more that what this case represents. And I think what the case represents symbolically to a lot of people is something that I think as a community, we haven't necessarily addressed or managed in the most optimal, adequate, satisfactory way. And that's the issue of a term that's been coined, spiritual abuse. The idea of religious figures and religious leadership becoming corrupt and utilizing their positions and platforms to prey upon vulnerable people and populations and commit egregious crimes, abuse, violations of trust, violations of faith, violations of community standards, whatever it may be. And there's obviously a range when it comes to spiritual abuse, just like all other forms of abuse, from forms, I don't want to use the word minor to minimize it, but forms that are extremely serious and criminal, and forms that do not necessarily meet the legal standard of a crime, but are extremely unethical, and are things that are either haram in the Sharia or a person, not necessarily haram, but perhaps makes them disqualified from being in positions of leadership. What I want to do is reflect on a few domains, and then I want to open it up for question and answer and for opportunity for people as well to talk about things or to steer the conversation into directions and angles that they feel they want some clarity or guidance on. So, trigger warning is going to obviously be a very heavy class. It's not a class that I was at all looking forward to, of course. But the one thing that I hope to achieve from this class is a few things. Number one, an awareness and an understanding of spiritual abuse itself and its various forms, so that we as individuals, as family members or people in charge of vulnerable people, and as a community, can be safe and protected as much as is of course humanly possible. The second thing is, I hope that as we are struggling to find the words to understand how we're feeling or understand what this all means, I hope that perhaps this evening can inshallah ta'ala be an evening of some healing, where we will see the pathway towards trust being rebuilt and restored and faith revived. It's very difficult class for me, honestly, because this whole week I've been, just extremely disturbed, just extremely saddened at the state of the da'wah and at the state of the ummah and so many different levels. Subhanallah, as if the genocide in Gaza was not enough of a trauma over our heads to have to see and witness daily, then seeing these sorts of things now start to come to light within our own communities. Of course, this is something far away, but at the same time, close in the sense that, of course, it's occurring in the Western world, with figures and speakers that we might have listened to or learn Quran from, etc., etc. So it's been very difficult on me personally for this week. But I felt that this was something that was important because I think there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of difficulty in understanding the framing. And of course, when you look to social media, which is the only place where it's really being discussed, social media and WhatsApp groups, you have the Twitter mob, you have all sorts of people with agendas and who are ideologically driven, who are creating narratives and creating interpretations that could actually be very harmful and can actually be something that is counterproductive as well. So Bismillah. I want to talk about 4 things, inshallah. The first thing will be about spiritual abuse. The second will be about the concept of being deceived by people. The third thing will be talking about finding trust and faith. And the fourth thing will be about the pillars of a safe community. As for the first one, the concept of spiritual abuse, the first question comes, is this a concept that exists within our tradition? Is this a concept that exists within our deen? Do we see examples of spiritual abuse that Allah might highlight in the Quran? Or the Prophet ﷺ might have told us about? When you look into the Quran, then you see that the concept of spiritual abuse, which you can define as utilizing your religious status within a religious community for your own personal gain. That's the most broadest definition of spiritual abuse. Is this something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns about in the Quran? Yes, it is. And it's actually a recurrent theme with the Bani Israel. When you look in Surah Al-Baqarah, and you look, not just in Surah Al-Baqarah, you find it coming up in Surah Al-Imran, in Surah Al-Shura, and many different places. You find this concept of the Bani Israel, and particularly the scholars of the Bani Israel, being corrupt and becoming corrupt. In the second surah, in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَوَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ ثُمَّ يَقُولُونَ هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ يَشْتَرُونَ Allah al-kadhib. They would write the book with their own hands, and they would then say, this is from Allah. يَشْتَرُونَ بِهِ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. Why would they do that? So that they could get money, wealth. This is spiritual abuse. This is a spiritual abuse of literally the text and the revelations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, perverting and diverting the texts in order for your own personal, political, whatever objective. So you see this amongst the Bani Israel. You see the idea of the corrupt scholar. You see the idea of a person that studied, and Allah would testify that they've studied their books, that these are people knowledgeable of the Tawrat. And Allah describes in Surah Al-Jum'ah, كَمَثَلِ الْحِمَارِ يَحْمِلُ أَسْفَارًا, that the example of them is like a riding animal, like a donkey that is carrying just asfara. It's interesting, it's the only place in the Quran, by the way, that the term asfara is used to describe books. And it's interesting because this is similar to a Hebrew word that describes pages and books as well. So it's a play on words of the Arabic and the Hebrew, because of course this is addressed to the Bani Israel. And so the verse now obviously is going to sound different to them when the Arabic is there, but a word is used that's actually the one derived from the Hebrew, which is a beautiful thing about the eloquence of the Quran. And it's just as a side tangent, it's an interesting new field of investigation that we're starting to see of the intertextuality between the Quran and the Bible, and also other Near Eastern sources of Christian sources that were there, where the Quran actually utilizes play on words and references subtle things that only the people so knowledgeable about those scriptures would understand and say, oh my goodness, the same word that was used there is used over here, and understand the reference. الَّذِينَ يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. They recognize it just like they recognize their students. If anyone's interested in this, by the way, there's a beautiful paper written by Aussie, Taha Sumoro from Melbourne. It's called The Quran and the Bible, the Quranic engagement with the Bible, and just type in Quran, Bible, Yaqeen, you'll get it. Quran, Bible, Yaqeen, and you'll see some incredible examples. Anyways, this verse itself, يَحْمِلُ أَسْفَارًا, they are carrying this asfara. So Allah is describing them that actually what they've learned is nothing. It's just carried on their backs. So these are people who have learned, but they've become corrupt. They've learned, but they have become corrupt. That's in the Quran. That's in the Quran. In the Sunnah, do we have this concept? Yes. Who is the first people that will be thrown into the hellfire?
Someone who has ilm and doesn't share it?
No. Yes. Very good. Jazakumullah khairan, Abdul-Rahman. The Qari, it's actually said in other places, some would say alim, but most of the riwayat say the Qari, the reciter of the Quran, the shaheed, and the musaddaq, and the one who gave in charity. These are the first three people thrown into hellfire. And the Quran is the one that's actually used at the beginning, the Qari. Why? It will be said, what did you do with your life? Oh Allah, I learned your book and recited it for your sake. And he said, no, you did it so that people would say that about you. And they did, and so you got your reward. And so now taste the fire. So this is something that's recognized. The story of Barsisa in the Sunnah as well. The story of Barsisa, the monk who was a monk from the previous generations, from the previous ummah. And he was actually a monk that lived in a hermitage. So basically it was just him worshipping Allah, and that's all he did. Like he had no job, nothing else. The community would basically support him, and all he did 24/7 was worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, write scripture, all this stuff. That was what Barsisa did. One family is leaving town, and they're leaving their young daughter behind, unmarried. And obviously in those times, they don't have as much locked doors and security, and so it was customary that you would have people that would obviously look after vulnerable people. And so they asked Barsisa to look after their daughter. And so Barsisa first was reluctant, and they just kept insisting, and so then he accepted. And essentially, he was having to keep the food, give her the food, etc., etc. And the story goes essentially, first he leaves the food there, knocks and leaves. Then after that he says, oh, is it rude that I'm just leaving the food there and just knocking and leaving? Then he speaks and gives a greeting. Then he takes the food inside the house. Then he takes the food inside the house and stays a bit and sits with her, etc., etc. Then essentially one thing leads to another, and then zina occurs. Then zina occurs, and then she becomes pregnant with the child. And then he has the child, and he's afraid that this family is going to come back and they're going to find their daughter with a child, and I was the one who was looking after her. So the shaitan comes to him and basically whispers, look, this is horrible, your reputation will be gone and finished. It's finished now, they're going to come. There's only one way to deal with this. You have to kill her. Otherwise she's going to tell what happened. And so he goes and kills her. Then the shaitan says, now you have to kill the child. Kills the child. Buries them both. And then the shaitan basically says, this person, they're going to come and they're going to see that you've killed them both. Worship me, and then I will protect you. And then he makes sajda to the shaitan. And so Barsisa the monk becomes a zani, a murderer, and a mushrik. And this was the pathway. So this idea of, again, the religious figure becoming corrupt. So this is something that we find in the Sunnah, and we find it in the Quran. We find it in the Quran as well, as we've spoken about. The question comes, so we understand spiritual abuse, it's a thing, it exists. The Quran alludes to it. The Sunnah talks about the consequences of it. One question that people have asked me, and a lot of people have in their mind, is how? How is it that a person who recites Quran, who's learned this deen, who's spent years and years and decades learning and sacrificing, who's taught so many people, etc., etc., how can they go from one place to another? What is that pathway? How is that possible? I want to shed some light on this. Before I do that, I want to give you a statistic. It might shock you. They did a study as to the prevalence of psychopaths in careers. And surprise, surprise, at the top was business CEO, lawyer, surgeon. Not against any of the CEOs, lawyers, or surgeons here. But it's more about, those are the people, and I'm pretty sure everyone who's in those fields will tell you, yes, I understand exactly that because of the people that they encounter in their workplace. But they did the top 10 careers out of all the hundreds of careers. Number 8 was religious clergy. Number 8 was religious clergy. The question is why? It's obvious when you think about it. Because, from 2 ways. Number 1, if you're a person that has this, and psychopathy, by the way, is a very complex thing. You know, we're still kind of studying it and understanding it from a psychological point of view, where it comes from, is there a genetic component, is it a set of personality traits, etc., etc. But the one who is basically tending towards wanting to dominate other people, control other people, be in power over other people, be able to manipulate people, that sort of thing, there is no stronger position than a religious leader. Because the people will literally listen to the religious leader in all affairs of their life. Their financial decisions, their marital decisions, their obviously their worship, the most intimate secrets, everything. That's within the relationship with the religious leader. And so people who want to be in power over other people will be attracted to those positions naturally. That's the first way. The second way is the other part, which is the idea of power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. That when a person is in that position and they see that power and they see the vulnerability of other people and they see how much their words mean to an individual or people or group of people, that then changes something within them. So it can work on both sides in regards to understanding the statistic. Now, to go a bit more detailed, there are 3 real components to a religious figure turning from someone who might be sincere to becoming corrupt. There are 3 things. Number 1 is persona. Number 2 is position of power. And number 3 is access. By the way, this is for anyone. It doesn't have to be a religious leader. Any person, any Muslim, any believer, these are the 3 things. Persona, position of power, and access. The first thing is persona. What do I mean by persona? It is when a caricature of yourself that's not true and real is created in the eyes and perceptions of other people. So there's a persona that you put on when you are in certain types of gatherings. And this persona could be a religious person, a person of knowledge, a person of akhlaq, a person of all these sorts of things. This is the persona that comes. And it's not real. It's not real akhlaq per se. It's a persona. And the persona is built by both parties. By the individual and by the audience and by the people and by the fans and by the students and the social media followers and all these different places. It's built by both. So a person puts out maybe a particular piece of content, and that's the only thing a follower would know about this person. Just the one reminder that they put. And automatically then, in their head, they have this person. What are the things that are filled in their memories with this person? He said this, she said this, that, and the other. It's a collection of only khair. Because obviously that's the social media page. That's the halaqah. Which no one's going to go into the sorry, you want to get just the battery. No one's going to go into the social media page and talk about what they had for breakfast, although people still do that. They're not going to go and show their silly side or like show them in a vulnerable light or show them in a way that they are their family or whatever it may be. That's why Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, he made sure to always shatter the persona that people had of him. One time, he called the people in the minbar. He was the Khalifa. He called the people. Like you can imagine, that's like the emergency alert, right? Everyone comes and gathers to the masjid. It has to be something really important. He comes and he gathers them and he stands on the minbar and he starts to say, oh everyone, and he starts to tell people about his childhood. I used to tend goats and I used to have to deal with their feces and I did this thing and I was this silly. And they're like, Ya Umar, why did you bring us here? And he said, I felt something, so I wanted to shatter it. So he shattered the persona. Even on his deathbed, when he was stabbed and about to die, people were coming and they were praising him and they were showering him with eulogies about how incredibly just he was as a leader, what he did to defend the borders of Islam and expand the borders of Islam. The most rapid expansion out of all of the Khulafa was Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh. And he then said to his son, put my head on the dirt. And at first he refused, and he said sternly to put his head on the dirt. And even Ibn Umar al-Khattab was dying, he was still scary. And so Ibn Umar radiallahu anh places his head on the dirt to shatter that persona. So the persona, as I said, generated from both. When a person has this persona, and then they start to believe it, they start to think that that's them. And they start to lose themselves in this persona. That's the first destructive step. So now you've got this persona that's not actually you, because there's a difference between performative akhlaq and real akhlaq. Performative akhlaq is very easy. You just need to be socially smart to know how to do performative akhlaq. How to act humble, how to say the right thing, how to talk about your accomplishments in a humble way. They call it a humble brag. How to present yourself to other people in a way that they would think that you are an XYZ person. That's very different than true akhlaq. What's the difference? Performative akhlaq is driven by the want to please other people, whereas true akhlaq is driven by the want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the fundamental difference. It's an intention difference. Wanting people to have a good opinion of you and like you is not a bad thing per se, but that has to be secondary. The primary fundamental intention, that is the difference between performative akhlaq, which then creates a persona, with true akhlaq, is for whose sake. And so the persona is formed. The persona is formed. And I'll just say here as well that there's a balance, because amongst scholarship, there's this idea of maru'ah. There's this idea of having a sense of dignity and integrity by which you conduct yourself in public. Those who did the Young Da'is program, I spoke about this there. There is a concept of a maru'ah that goes beyond kind of what you have, but it's just because you are associated with knowledge, so you have to act in a certain dignified way in public, because otherwise, if you act kind of in a goofy way or a way that you are with your family in public, then people will start to lose respect for the deen itself. So there's this concept that exists. And so that's why you have the invention of like a certain robe and cloak that is known that the ulama will wear that particular cloak. Like the white cloak for doctors, for example, is more popular in North America. It's this idea of you remind yourself of the responsibility of what you're doing. You're wearing the white coat and you recognize the trust that comes with it. Similarly, you don the cloak, you don the turban. In different schools and madaris, you'll see they all have different types of hats and turbans and kufis that are associated with those institutions. Like Al-Azhar has that particular turban style with the red cap and then the white around. Deoband and Darul Ulum, they have their Sunnah turban with the tail flowing in the back. You have obviously in Medina or Saudi or Riyadh, you have the ghutra, the shamagh that's worn, right? So there is this kind of, you can say, a bit of a persona that is being created. Like I said, there's an element like with salt. Why this is important, we understand that. But this can lead as well to the problem that we're talking about, where a person puts on the show. They put on it's like a play. They put on the wardrobe, they look the part, they speak in the very particular style, and they mimic, the person, and they pretend to be XYZ person. You're creating a persona, and that is going to lead to long-term consequences. What's going to happen? As I said, this persona is being built. You confuse yourself with the persona. You think that you've built your own akhlaq, but actually you haven't. You haven't done the spiritual work. It's actually not a part of you and who you are. So the persona is made, and you think you're that persona, but it's not. So what happens? Who's in actual control of you and your behaviors? It's your unchecked nafs. The nafs ammara bisu. The nafs that commands to evil. The ego, the self that commands to evil. That's actually what's in control. And it's getting excited and feeling pleasure by you performing your persona because of the social status, because of the praise, because of the power that you're putting yourself into. So you have the ego that's controlling the puppet of this persona until the discongruence becomes so large, it becomes like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the persona is that first ingredient. The second one is position of power. So you could have this persona, like for example, you could be a student and you always come to classes just decked out, putting on this persona basically, the talibul ilm persona. And this is an issue for a lot of talibul ilm, is that they're more interested in the talibul ilm persona than actually learning the actual ilm and knowledge. Buying the right type of kufi, wearing the right type of scarf, put the right type of brand of miswak and the right oud and the right everything, and walking into the masjid in the right type of way, and all these sorts of performative things, right? But these people are not in positions of power. So the damage, they can't really do much damage. They just kind of come in. People are like, oh, what's that smell? It smells really nice, mashallah. Just decked out and mashallah. It's good to do that. Please do that, by the way. That's one of the things I hate the most, is standing next to someone in salah and just the BO is just, oh my goodness. Especially in Taraweeh, oh my God. Ya Allah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all, ameen. Maybe that's a form of spiritual abuse. I'm making someone have to stand next to you and smell that for like 10 minutes. Anyways, but the person who comes in and that is not in a position of power, so generally speaking, they're not that harmful. But it's a problem, because obviously it's like a minor form of nifaq, it's riyah, it's that sort of thing. Second ingredient becomes the position of power, where now the person is in an actual position where they are in a position of power, authority, leadership over people. People look up to them. People will listen to them. People will trust them. Then the third part is access. You make an environment that you have access to vulnerable people in private. And so this could be things like counseling one-on-one. And that's a big thing. And this is where a lot of this happens. And when you hear stories, of spiritual abuse, a lot of it starts from this bab, from this personal one-on-one counseling of a brother and a sister, or a sheikh and a sister, or whatever it may be. Or a very isolated kind of area that's like a place where a teacher is just with young students in Quran, for example, access. So this is the third part. That's the environmental aspect of things as well. Because you can have the persona and you can have power, but you don't have any access. Like you only just come, give a talk somewhere on a stage, and then you're gone. There's no access. Like, what are you going to do? But the access comes with personal relationships, with these counseling services, one-on-one Quran lessons, these sorts of things, where a person will then have access to be able to control and manipulate another person. Now the question is, how does it become so perverse? And it goes back to the point of the persona. The more and more that persona is so different to what the person actually is, that tension creates a nafs that is full of weird fantasies and weird desires, because of the huge discongruence between how they act in one particular part of their life and then how they are in another part. That gap just gets wider and wider and wider until it's like two completely different people. So this is the issue of spiritual abuse, how it's found in the Quran and Sunnah, and how it essentially develops, and what are the ingredients behind it. The second theme that I wanted to address was the idea of being deceived. And this is a big thing. People, one of the things, it's not just about how could this happen, it's also about, who do I trust? Like, XYZ person, and this is not just an isolated incident, there have been other cases as well. And it ranges from high profile to completely low profile, to just the basement Quran teacher, to whoever it may be. So this is not an issue that's only affecting one particular type of people or organization or whatever it may be. Realize that the deception of people is a real thing, and not to hit yourself out over the head about it. The first thing that ever happened to a human being was being deceived. Imagine Adam and Hawa are in a Jannah, not the Jannah, but in a Jannah. Allah says, eat whatever you wish, just one tree, don't go there. And how beautiful it must have been in that Jannah. They couldn't imagine that some creature within that Jannah, such a pure place, who claims to be Nasih and Amin, that claims to be a sincere advisor to them, would deceive them and lead them and groom them into a place that would have disastrous consequences. But of course that was the shaitan. And that was the first instance of deception, where human beings can be deceived. And that's why you look in the Quran, you find from the beginning, يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. It's literally like the second page of the Quran. They wish to deceive Allah and those who believe. Talking about the munafiqun, the hypocrites. يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَمَا يَخْدِعُونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسَهُمْ وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. They do not deceive anyone except themselves, and they are not aware. This idea of people deceiving other people, Allah says in Surah Al-Munafiqun and other verses in the Quran as well, تُعْجِبَكَ أَجْسَامَهُم. You will be impressed with their form, with the way that they look. وَإِن تَسْمَعْ لِقَوْلِهِمْ. And if you hear their words in their speech, in other places, قَوْلًا زُخْرُفًا قَوْلُ غُرُورًا. Like golden speech that's so deceptive. You'll be so impressed with the way they speak, with their eloquence, with their form, with how they look, etc., etc. It's scary from that point of view. But this is a deception that can happen to people. And this is something that we never know what's on the inside of a person. And so that leads me to the third theme I want to reflect on, is finding trust and faith in amidst all of this. So, on the one hand, one of the messages here is, of course, this idea of be careful. Be careful, be wary. We need to have safe spaces where people who are predators cannot have the access and the power to be able to manipulate other people, to be able to prey on other people. And at the same time realizing that it's never going to be 100%, no matter what structural changes that you put into anything. We need to have blue checks, blue cards and criminal checks and all these policies in place. At the end of the day, this is a part of the world that Allah has created. It's a world of ibtila and tests and trials, and awful things happen. And nobody is going to be able to 100% stop a predator. Obviously, we do our utmost best to review things and ensure that our spaces are safe. But at the same time, we have to recognize this. And it's not to say that we then lose our trust in people, or trust in the ulama, or trust in the imams, or trust in religious leaders, or in any leadership, or anything like this. It's very difficult, because something like this is very shocking, because when someone is betrayed, one of the things that's very difficult for them to process is the fact that their current way of looking at the world could not fathom that a crime like this could come from a place like that. Like that wasn't even a concept. And that's what creates that trauma, like that sense of, I have no idea what's going on anymore. Because the mental structures that you have to interpret the world didn't account for this. And so now you don't know what to believe and who to trust anymore. Because you have certain heuristics about living comfortably in the world is full of threats. And as you grow and as you go through life experiences, you develop a map and you have a certain unspoken understanding of going through the world and understanding where safety is, where danger is, where you can trust, where you can be happy, where you can be yourself. And when things happen like this, a betrayal of trust of the highest magnitude, then it just shatters everything. I don't know if anything is true anymore. I don't know who I can trust anymore. And some people might even turn into a crisis of faith for some people. Like, these are people who taught Quran. This is people who are, teaching the deen. And is this actually true? How can a person who preaches this is the impact that they have on them? And this type of hypocrisy, it's very challenging. It's very challenging. The first principle to go back to is, number one, to not become completely cynical. There's two extremes. Becoming completely cynical. This is why, I'm not going to trust anybody, and XYZ, and completely cynical on one side. And on the other side, being naive and continuing to be naive and covering up for people and that sort of thing. The most important thing is to understand, to live in this world, trust is a very important part of human relationships. If you lose that completely, you've lost the ability to actually relate to anybody. So it's a very important thing, trust. But the trust for other people in the community should be rooted in your trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that your confidence in being protected from the shar of another person is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not the other person himself. And whilst you recognize that, as we said, anybody can become corrupted, anyone can go into whatever direction you... Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he said, whoever wishes to find whoever wants to find a sunnah to follow, like a path to follow or a person to follow, then let him find the role model from the dead, because the living is not safe from becoming corrupted. So understanding this, but not looking at everyone then as like is this person, who's the next person, and who's the next major person, the next sheikh, this is a dark place, that a thing like this can certainly put a person towards, and as we've seen with social media, has certainly done that. But then you've lost yourself, you've lost your ummah, you've lost your sense of community, and you've lost the sight of the fact that at the end of the day, that these are always going to be minority. وَلَا تَسْتَوِ الْخَبِيثَ وَالطَّيِّبُ وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ كَثْرَةُ الْخَبِيثِ. The khabith and the tayyib are not equal. Even if the abundance of the khabith astonishes you, realize that the tayyib is always more. That there's always more khair in the ummah, in the community. There's always more, much more amazing, great scholars and ulama to look up to and to be able to relate to than there is these scenarios and these instances. But rooting your trust, as I said, in a tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's not about not trusting a person so that we're careful with our children and vulnerable people, but it's about not putting yourself or other people into a position where things could be compromised. Like as we said, the three things: persona, power, and access. If you take access out, then that's a huge barrier to a lot of different things that can occur. And so there's certain environmental factors so that it cannot corrupt you. Because sometimes everything is fine. The moment the access is there, that's when the shaitan starts to whisper in a person's head. When you remove the access, it's not there. One principle of the shaitan hardly will whisper like the most heinous things from the start. That is just absolutely insane that you would even consider doing. But when things become within the realm of control and everything, that's when the shaitan starts to whisper. So this brings us to the fourth point, which is pillars of a safe community. What are the pillars of a safe community? The first pillar of a safe community, Allah says in the Quran, كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. Number one, a community that does not stand for evil and oppression. أمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر. This is such an important value for a community to have, for it to be safe, for its people to constantly be calling out the wrong and encouraging the good and the ma'ruf. And this comes to that whole issue of, and this is actually a good thing, and I'll say there's a good takeaway from the reaction, the strong reaction of the community globally, is that there's khair in the ummah. That there was this reaction, that there was outrage, that there was a sense of dhulm has been done and people are angry. Now obviously we can disagree about the displacement of that anger and who it's directed towards, and what, that's fine. But the anger is there. What's that a sign of? Iman. That's a sign of an alive ummah. There are other religious faith communities where these things happen and the whole church, the whole people just put it under the rug. Just few people might be hurt and then they just suffer in silence. This is a situation where something happens halfway across the world. Thousands of Muslims all across the world are affected, feeling the pain, being upset, to the point that here in Brisbane we're even talking about it. So this is a good thing. Amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi anil munkar is so important when it comes to having a safe community, calling things out and encouraging people to do that. Having principles in place, and this is the idea of when you look at things like when these types of things happen in schools or in different places, they start to have these things like see something, say something. Public campaigns against abuse. Educating parents and being stranger safe for the children, etc., etc. These are the sorts of things. Number two, so the first one was communal, the second one is more individual, taqwa. Taqwa is, of course, one of the foundations of a safe community. When there's a community of people who have taqwa, that is a very safe community. And that's a principle in everything. Business partner, marriage partner, whatever it may be. Taqwa is that first thing. If a person has fear of Allah, then everything else comes afterwards. Taqwa is the ingredient that you can be safe with another person if they have. Taqwa. A third pillar of a safe community is actually strong marriages. Strong marriages. And in most of these cases, almost invariably, in these cases, in scenarios, it's not the case that you find a person who has a happy, fulfilled marriage. Strong marriages are very important. That's why the shaitan, one of the main goals of the shaitan, as we know, is to cause some faraq, some separation between husband and wife. That's when the shaitan says to the other shayateen, anta, you, and brings him to sit on his throne of darkness over the water. Strong marriages are a very important part of having a safe community because strong marriages create safe families, and safe families are, of course, the pillar of safe communities. Barriers to marriage, having young people who aren't able to get married, people who are getting into the late 20s, early 30s, not married, unmarried, and then having to then assume positions of obviously leadership because they're in their mid-30s, never been married, etc., etc., or they get married late in their early 30s, or late 30s, or whatever it may be. Then there's dissatisfaction because they've lived so much of their life independent, and now they meet this person and it's not the same as if they would have gotten married if they were much younger. And there's all these different issues, and you might think that this is far-fetched, but it's actually very connected here. That there's a strong emphasis in Islam of building strong marriages, strong and fulfilling marriages, so that a person doesn't build deranged fantasies and weird ideas and these sorts of things that then manifest in the most obscene ways. A fourth pillar of a safe community are strong ethical commitments. And this is a point, and this is the final point I want to reflect on. This is really important. I think that the reaction, I'm going to talk a little bit about social media and seeing what's kind of coming out of there. This is not about this particular case, because when you actually look at the particular case, this is a case of a mother abusing her child and this Quran teacher abusing both of them, and everything all together in a place completely separate to an actual Islamic school or religious organization or anything like this. But this case, as I mentioned earlier, happens on a backdrop of other cases that this symbolically represents that clearly our community has not addressed appropriately. And these are cases of spiritual abuse, things actually happening in religious spaces, of people utilizing their positions upon other people to further their personal gain. And there are instances of people who have done these things very clearly, and after a few years they're back on the speaker circuit, they're back platformed and going and massing huge crowds and all over the world as if nobody cares. Where's the strong ethical commitment? There are people, I'm not going to mention any names, but there are people, if they did what they did and you were in medicine, you would not have your medical license for the rest of your life. You would never practice medicine again. But yet, for some reason, for our religious preachers, our ethical standard is lower than a kufr system. If you had a psychologist who was counseling a woman who had issues with her marriage, and this person who's a man encourages her to get divorced and then marries that person, you tell me, would Australia tolerate this? No, that person will be completely lose their license. The whole book will be thrown at them. But yet if people can do this and still be platformed, still be positions of power, and have people cover up for them and say, oh, no, 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 don't talk about this, no, hide away the sins, etc., etc. This is an important principle. Yes, there are principles of the Sharia of such sort of, of hiding people's sins and whatnot. But there's also the maslahah of public interest and safety of the community as well. And there's also an ethical standard that we have to be having a community of a zero tolerance policy when it comes to certain red lines where people are clearly abusing their power. And we cannot have a less ethical standard than a kufr system that we love to say, oh, the secular, liberal, blah, 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 and they're so blah, blah, blah. But yet look at our own backyard. Now I'm one of those people who go blah, 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 blah. So, but we have to also recognize and not say that in an arrogant way, but look deep into ourselves as well. And this is something that's really important, holding leadership to account. And, part of that is a structural issue. There's no like tribunal or ethics committee, for example, to regulate religious leadership or imams or people who are in positions of power. Like we don't have that system set up. Like you have that system set up in medicine, for example, very, very structurally, because obviously this happens in medicine. There are doctors who abuse their positions as well. And there's tribunals and ethics committees and whatnot. There certainly needs to be that to hold people to account and have actual consequences. And as I was saying, this case, the reason why it's gotten, it's because of how grotesque it was, of course, but it's unearthed all these other issues of like what's going on and trauma of people who have had issues as well with these sorts of things and have not been addressed. And they're seeing maybe their abusers still on social media, on posters, on here, going here, traveling the world. And nobody's saying anything about it. Nobody cares. People are fine to share the platform. This is something that's really important. Some of the people know here as well, without going into any specifics, but there was major figure that came through, to Brisbane, and they asked us, because obviously we are a part of a lot of these international people that come through, and I said no. I said, oh, it's been so long, it's been this, and the organization I was working with as well, they said, what do you think? I said, no. I don't care that, and it's like, and the reasoning given was, oh, nobody knows about that in Brisbane. Nobody knows about that over here. It's not a big deal. Like, oh, nobody knows about this, but it's like, no. There has to be strong ethical standards. There has to be consequences. There has to be this principled commitment. This is very important. And as I said, I think that this is the backdrop, and I think that what we're seeing, from a lot of reflection that's happening in this week's just been absolutely crazy. And I've been up since like 5 a.m. because of the time difference and stuff, just meetings and all these things and discussing and coming together and trying to come up with ideas and solutions and understanding the balance between placating to the Twitter mob and this like almost Piers Morgan-like, do you condemn Hamas situation where people are going with pitchforks and saying, why haven't you made a statement? Why haven't you made a statement? As if someone needs to make a statement about the most heinous thing. Like, what do you expect anyone to say? This is not an issue where there's any ambiguity there. Especially amidst where people are focusing their platform on the genocide and all those sorts of things that are happening in Palestine. There's that element there, and the problems of the court of public opinion and this Western postmodern framing of things, which is always blame the structures, always blame the people in power, always blame the male, person in power who's, abusing his power, etc., tear down institutions. It's always a structural problem. If you even, say anything about the mother, you're blaming the victim. This sort of framing, we don't realize, but for 10 years on social media, we have subliminally ingested this framing by seeing how everybody discusses everything else on social media. And then we are now coming to this issue with this. So that's a very important aspect to understand with this. But at the same time, then understanding, yes, there are serious problems. Yes, there needs to be a rethinking through and a reflection of an internal reflection. Even though this particular case didn't really happen in a situation that it was like in a masjid or anything like this, or taking like from a student or something like this, but it reminds us of actual situations that have happened in this way. and have not been addressed appropriately. And we really need to be able to do this because those are real serious issues. And if we're going to be an ummah that upholds ourselves to the standard of kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas, you're the best community ever brought forth for mankind, then we need to do this. But not by the ethical standard of, red pill, masculine, what do they call themselves, or the radical feminists, or the liberals, or whatever it may be, by our own ethical standards and our own ethical commitments. And many people are ignorant to certain concepts as well that are foreign to the West. Foreign to the West. There is a concept, I'm not saying it applies here, but there is a consideration that people think it just means nothing, of the idea of innocent till proven guilty. There is an idea and a concept of this, this notion of not necessarily publicizing every single instant. There is that notion. And at the same time, there is public interest, safety, making sure that the people are protected, making sure that things are called out, making sure there's consequences. There's all these considerations. It's about being balanced. And it's about pushing for these sorts of things. To conclude, it's a difficult time, and as I said, for different people and how close they are to whatever case and whatever it may be, it's difficult. And I want to acknowledge as well the difficulty amongst the sisters as well, and of course, people with children, parents, the difficulty of seeing this because parents send their kids to school with the Quran, etc., etc., and so it is very jarring. It's very disturbing. But the point is not to lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not to lose faith in the community, in the ummah, in the khair that does exist in the ummah, but to learn to temper this kind of aggrandization of the persona, like we talked about. I'm going to go back to these points. The persona, the performative, the expectation, of kind of making these figures that we want for us to be these holy, saintly figures, but realizing everyone's human. And it's also for the people as well who are in places of religious leadership to not believe in their own hype, to not allow the persona to continue, to balance between maru'ah and also being themselves, to not be in positions where they have access in these certain ways. SubhanAllah, a lot of people, they said, oh, and this is one of the things, and it's so funny because you see so many different people from different angles kind of trying to make the explanation as to why this occurred, as if there's a connection between any of that and the extreme pervertiveness of what we saw. People will say, oh, this is, see, the issue of Orthodox Islam and like people, these repressed mullahs and the things that they do, etc., etc. And on the other hand, it's, oh, do you see, this is the issue of why people put sisters on their posters and see, look, this is what's going to happen because on their social media there's sisters there, as if this has a connection to that. And I want to have a word on this because, as I said, this happens everywhere. In the most conservative of musallas, the most conservative of masajid and conservative of Quran places, this happens opposite genders, this happens same genders. This happens male to boy. This happens in many different ways. And in fact, I will say that the idea that somehow, if a person, gives a class, an Islamic class, for example, and they do it that the male teacher teaches the men separately on one day, and then teaches all of the women separately on another day, as if this is, oh, alhamdulillah, so saving the fitna from this. You tell me what's the worst fitna? This is an important point for us to understand, to not fall into this idea about things. There's a reason why, and even the wisdom and the thought behind how we have things in faith circle. There's a reason why everything is out in public. That's actually what the Sharia wants. Not for people to be alone with the opposite gender, for people to be in a place where it's just you and a group of sisters and a closed off environment, nobody can see. No, that's not the point. The safest place is the public arena. And sometimes we think, oh, we have to have this. It doesn't make any sense. In fact, that makes things less safe. And this is an important point for us to really understand when it comes to this. Having the boundaries, understanding the concept of khalwa, understanding, having things in the public arena. This is something that is really important for us. You know, it's interesting, subhanAllah, a lot of this stuff is related to a lot of the stuff that we do cover in da'wah dawa, the illness and the cure. Because we live in a time where there is an unprecedented amount of fawahish that people are exposed to. And no doubt it will derange people. And as a generation starts to grow in this environment and become our leaders, our ulama, our imams, our du'at, this is an important point for us as well on the individual level to ensure people get help. Because you never know what habits will turn into the most craziest things you could never imagine. There's young children here, but I do want to say that people become content with certain habits, not realizing what they will turn into. And especially in this day and age, it's very important that we nip things in the bud, as they say. It's really important that if there are certain habits that a person has, that they seek help. That they seek help, because as you, especially you in the audience here, you are all, especially those who come regularly and those who are involved in different organizations and masajid, you are all leaders, even if you're people of knowledge or not. You are all people in positions of leadership. Your actions, look at the actions of one person and what they did to the whole world, and what they did to organizations, and what they did to so many different things. Realize the responsibility on your neck. If you're involved in this, it gives you the higher responsibility to ensure that you are making sure that you are right by you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that if you are falling off the rails, you need to seek help. You need to seek help. You need to take it seriously. Because otherwise these things will grow and grow and grow, and you have no idea where it will take you as the persona develops in the community, and this goes. And this is an important warning point for everyone, that this pathway to this is something that can happen to anyone, especially with the unprecedented amount of fawahish that people have access to. I mean, the nonchalance in which people have of watching and seeing things that are so obscene these days. No problem watching the shows and the movies that have the most disgusting things that are there. You're desensitized to these things. It's having an effect on your mind. It's making a generation, have these weird, fetishized, perverse ideas because of what's being pushed, the satanic kind of fawahish. And this, combined with what we've talked about, is a dangerous thing. And we have to have a bit of hindsight as well. We have to have a bit of foresight as well, and realize this is a generation that's grown up exposed to the most craziest of things from like 9, 8 years old, 10 years old. If this doesn't wake us up to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, engage in more qiyam al-layl, like being terrified of our own nafs, then we're looking at it the wrong way. That's the last point that I want to take from all of this, is the individual introspection. With that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll conclude and open it up for questions.